I'll go ahead and let the team introduce themselves, and then we'll flip the camera around and let you see all of our participants.
Sure.
All right, yeah, I think you'll recognize this friendly face.
Hi, John.
And my name is Molly Selba. I'm a PhD student in the anthropology department here at University of Florida, and kind of leader here of this teacher workshop. We have 20 teachers from the southeastern United States who are all interested in incorporating human evolution into their science curricula, and would love to talk to you about that. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us.
Nice. And this is Molly's brainchild, and I'm helping out with the paleontological deep time aspect of it. I'm a master's student here at University of Florida studying vert paleo and structural geology. And I actually had the chance to work with Salindo. He works at, goes to WITS. He was mentioning that earlier. So we're excited to have you, and we look forward to see what you got for us.
Fantastic.
And
So,
I just tell you that what we've, I just told the basics of the Naledi story. So our audience is well versed kind of on who you are and the basic story. A quick bit of, I did a little bit of Sediba, and then the rundown on Naledi. So
fantastic. And who's the audience here? Can I see them?
Around, flip it around, and there's our one.
Hi, everyone. Fantastic. Well, if by the way, if at any time the sound cuts out or we start getting funny business on this, just wave your hand a little bit and I'll know to stop. I'm gonna not take too long because I'd like to get to Q&A and start and have a discussion with you about some of my ideas on human evolution. But I'd like to give you a little bit of background to where I come from, what my sort of early career areas were, and the kind of period that fomented my thoughts on first science communication, the importance of outreach, but also how I've taken a strategy after 30 years of science communication in teaching evolution and having discourse, both at the student level, and I do speak to tens of thousands of students every year, but also to the general public, because the audience actually isn't that different, as well as useful in talking to people like administrators and even politicians. And the reason I'll actually delve into some of that is I think often you'll find yourself speaking to those kind of people in one capacity or the other. You may do it on radio shows, you may get challenged by administrators or even local government officials on the concepts of teaching evolution. So I'm going to be speaking at some levels which may surprise you in the conversation that we're going to have, but I wanted you to know the reason why I'm going to go those, because I actually think you may find them useful in your experiences. To give you a little bit of bona fides on this, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in a little town, actually 15 miles outside of a little town called Sylvania, Georgia, which at that time had about 12 to 1,500 people in it. And so I am very familiar with the issues which surround the teaching and the discourse of evolution in the Deep South, which translates to the Midwest. Of course, I was born in Kansas, and I've actually delivered lectures there during the People of Kansas versus the Board of Education. So I am familiar with the issues very familiar with the issues that are in the states. I actually grew up within them and grew up in school system that didn't teach evolution in a straightforward way, something I think probably many of you are familiar with, and that went right into my university level where when I went to Georgia Southern, in fact, and encountered some professors who tended to couch around the idea of teaching evolution directly, largely to avoid conflict. The idea of the way evolution was taught when I was young, and in fact I've seen taught to this day, is sort of, it's an option. That is, it's not necessarily given, it's a theory, and probably many of you have heard that used many, many times, and that there are alternatives to that, and often creationism, and the idea of teaching a particular type of creationism, and usually it's a fundamentalist type view, whether that be Baptist or Methodist or more evangelical types, is given as a viable alternative to the teaching of evolutionary biology or sciences. And that's the way I grew up, with the idea of they would kind of couch both sides. I'm going to be forced to teach this as a biology teacher, but there are other ideas, and this is just a theory. And I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you in that room about encountering that sort of discourse or argument. I did my undergraduate university in the United States, and then I moved to first Kenya with Harvard University, and then with the Kubifora field schools, and worked on those field programs under Richard Leakey up at Lake Turkana. And this is now in the late 1980s, 1988, 1989, and then took a risk and moved to South Africa in 1990 when it was announced that Nelson Mandela was going to be released. And that was a very high-risk time to do that because South Africa was still under the apartheid system. But the reason I chose to do that was that the East Africa at that time was closed effectively to any young scientists or scholars who were trying to get into field exploration or the discovery of fossil hominids. John may have alluded to this, but in the late 80s and early 90s, these were probably the rarest sought after objects on planet Earth. There were actually more scientists than there were objects we studied, and it was a very, very competitive field, human origins. And the reason I'm mentioning that to you is not only it's part of the storyline that I'm going to take you up to the Naledi discovery that John has talked to you about, it's also important to understand some of the weaknesses that have been put forward when talking about human origins in the past. And to be blunt, many of them justifiable. There have been scientists, including myself, who have stood up with tiny little fragments and started way over describing the sort of characters of the former owner of that particular bone, its stature, what it was. And that actually has made our field vulnerable in the past to justifiable criticism, which comes not only from scientific colleagues, but comes from the greater community at large. And the lesson that is quickly learned from that is that you know, the audiences aren't stupid, but often we scientists try to speak in languages that treat them as if they're stupid. We try to use words that make us sound highly intelligent, and that often alienates audiences. And I think nowhere is more evident of the disparity between the communication of scientists and how they've communicated and how poorly they've communicated with the general public than in the United States. And there's probably no field that's more true of than evolutionary biology or paleoanthropology or any of the fields around that. Some of that, I suspect, has to do with where the major centers of these sciences, and particularly my science, are. They tend to be centered on the upper East Coast of the United States as well as on the upper West Coast. And so most of the scientists who are in those major tier 1 universities or private universities are actually, we used to say in the South, preaching to the choir. And are very, you know, you can go into New York City or Seattle, and the audience of 2,000 people there's no one in the room that disagrees with what you're doing. But that is not what you encounter in many other parts of the United States, and certainly what I was alluding to, and I would imagine many of you are not preaching to those type of choirs. You're often struggling with how to deal with the story of human evolution. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it in warts and all. So in 1991, once I did move to South Africa to start my PhD, I had the great fortune of I started an exploration project. There had been no new fossil sites discovered in sub-equatorial Africa in 48 years. And within about 18 months of arriving in South Africa, I discovered the first new site. And in fact, that was 2 teeth. And I'm embarrassed to say that joining the sort of thematic ideas of the time, I made a very big deal out of that. I was young, I was a PhD student, 2 teeth made National Geographic magazine at the time. And if you actually go back and look at some of the media coverage from that time, you'll see that there was a great deal said about those teeth that probably we shouldn't have said. But I'm emphasizing that because that was the way in which we handled the discourse of paleoanthropology, because we were a field of scraps. We had almost no evidence, and I'm being blunt and honest about that. Anyone who's seen something like the Lucy skeleton will know we describe that as a 40% complete skeleton when, you know, I would imagine that many 5th graders could tell you it's more like 20%, unless you're counting every rib fragment that's included within it. And these were problems of the field of paleoanthropology as it emerged. It was a field that was dealing with very fragmentary, very rare evidence, and therefore a great deal was made out of every single fragment. Add to that the popularity of the subject, because everyone is interested in their own origins, and it is probably second only to dinosaur paleontology in its appeal to the public, and you have the makings of a vulnerability when using it to teach things like evolution. And you have an excellent someone you can quiz deeply within that. John Mead is a pioneer in doing that to very young children, but can give you probably some very personal experiences of the difficulty of teaching the subject using reconstructed fossils, fragments. And when children, and I think you of all groups would understand, children are enormously perceptive and they don't get the wool pulled over their eyes very easily. But I had made my first discovery, and I knew that at any moment that these 2 teeth, which were discovered at a site called Gainesville, would launch my career into the cocktail parties that are the aim of every university professor forever, because I knew that in just a moment, you know, I was going to do a breaststroke or move a rock, and there was going to be that half of a mandible that would be my big discovery. That didn't occur. I would spend the next 17 years beating my head against the hard rocks that were made up Gladysville. I would spend my time eventually branching out into other sites. I would find a few more fragmented fossil hominids in the middle 90s and then late 90s, but that big discovery eluded me. I was having a great scientific career. It was during that period that I understood that there was an intense passion in people to understand human origins, but it was also a period where I learned firstly of the enormous limitations of our field, the scarcity of the fossil record, and the way in which we dealt with that through the access to fossils. Our field became known for its closed nature, its clubbiness, where scientists would make a discovery and hold on it for years, if not decades, under the auspices of doing quote unquote good science. And that good science was really a secret word for control and power, because in a field where discoveries are rare, the control over access to rare evidence is the power that's generated in this field. But I was very fortunate, because I was also publishing on other things within the field, to be promoted at a very young age. In 1996, I was given Philip Tobias's chair of paleoanthropology at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, which was the traditional academic seat of human origins on the continent of Africa. Raymond Dart had discovered the Tong Child in 1924. Philip Tobias in the late 1950s had inherited that chair from Raymond Dart, and I was his successor within it. And that gave me control over what was then one of the largest collection of fossil hominids in the world, about 600, 700 individual elements, largely made of isolated teeth from sites like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans in South Africa. And that's where I found myself as I went in through the 90s. working on trying to make that big discovery, trying to launch exploration. I truly did believe there was more out there to be discovered, but that certainly wasn't coming true in my books, and in fact, it wasn't coming true globally. The global story of human origins by the middle and late 90s and even into the early 21st century was that we had pretty much discovered everything. And that's going to sound hard to believe as after you've heard the story that John Mead told you, but also some of the issues I'm going to talk to in a moment. But it was a dire period in human origin study. If any of you want to see, to understand that I'm not exaggerating this, Tim White, who arguably was probably the most powerful paleoanthropologist in the world by the turn of the 21st century, wrote an article, I believe in 2001, in the Yearbook of Physical Anthropology about the state of paleoanthropology at the millennium, where he said very clearly that this field was over, that there would be no new major discoveries, that we understood the pathways of human origins, that the fossil fields were drying up, we should stop issuing permits into these because we go back and back and the results are dwindling every year. We should stop training young people to be paleoanthropologists. And that this was effectively the end of the fossil period of human origins research. The only hope would be the sort of biological studies that were emerging then with ancient DNA and things like that. That was a despairing time to be a paleoanthropologist. That sort of idea was widespread throughout the field, and it was being brought true in reality. Explorers like me working in Africa, people working in East Africa, really were not making major new discoveries outside of the traditional known sites, and even those were not of the significance or level that they'd been 20, 30, 40 years prior to that. It also meant that there was a destruction in exploration funds. We saw the collapse of exploration funds, and we saw a rampant period of science communication that was centered around a very tiny number of elite players. And if you go back and look at the popular media, you look at the textbooks of that period, the story is being written by a handful of largely white male scientists that own the field of science, and with limited other information coming out. And that created a very strange environment for science communication, for education. And in fact, in that sort of era between the middle 90s and let's say about 2008 or 2009 was where a lot of the textbooks, a lot of the information, they're probably still housed, if they are in your textbooks, in your particular states, that are still housed within those came from. This sort of very, the idea of human origins would be talked about as a bush, but it would be taught as a ladder. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. The idea of where someone like me would stand up, or you look at a YouTube video, or you look at a textbook, they talk about, they give brief mention to a tree or a bush of human evolution, and then they go, well, but humans evolved from Anamensis to Ardipithecus, Anamensis, Afarensis, early Homo, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, modern humans. And so you had this oxymoron of the way we were talking about this and the way we were actually teaching this both to children in classrooms and communicating it to the general public. This was really the heyday of scientists standing up and holding up a fragment of a mandible and saying, you know, this is the earliest member of the genus Homo. I found the missing link without ever using the word missing link, and things like that. It was not a very healthy time. Exploration funds, as I said, died. My own university actually began the process of closing my exploration unit. And so during the period 2005, 2006, and 2007, I had the sort of unenviable task of participating in a job search to replace me. And what they were actually doing was looking to modernize the science under the understanding that there was really nothing left to be discovered in the fossil record of human origins and the archaeological record of human origins. The future was seen as the emerging technologies of scanning, CT scanning in particular, was all the rage, as well as computer mathematical modeling and geometric morphometrics and such. If you go back and look at the covers of Nature and Science during that later period, sort of 2005, 2006, 2007, that's what was dominating those very powerful and very influential journals. And so we faced this, this place where it was a very dark future for any new discoveries, and technology was going to be an answer to analyzing those fossils that we already had. It was in that process that we eventually found a replacement for me, and I undertook what John may have told you about, a sort of soul searching for what I was going to do next, and that was when I became the last human being on Earth to discover Google Earth. And in December of 2007, and I did what all of you did when you discovered Google Earth before me. You looked at your home, right? and to see if you're lying naked by the pool, and I wasn't. And I then found the wonderful GPS coordinates that you can put in and how you could utilize that to fly up into space. And I had GPS coordinates I collected in the middle 90s. In late 90s on a very expensive National Geographic expedition to use modern technologies, GPS, and then very poor satellite images to find fossil sites. I put them in and quickly found out that they were all wrong. And that was one of my first true lessons in the disasters of science, and I'd spent 3 years of my life collecting them. The reason they were wrong, by the way, is because the US had owned the satellites in the late 90s, and they put deliberate error into them. So that, combined with the primitive nature of handheld GPS, created a compounding error that caused me to waste hundreds of thousands of dollars and 3 years of my life. But it turned out it wasn't a waste, because the magnificent free would allow me to see the sites I intended to map, and it was in the process of correcting the errors, moving the wrong dot to the right place, that it began to teach me what fossil sites and cave sites actually looked like from space. That led me into an expedition. That's a grand name for me getting into the car with a laptop and my dog and going out into the area and trying to ground truth what I thought were new sites, as Google seemed to teach me that there may be other sites. You have to remember that this was one of the most explored areas on planet Earth, just outside of Johannesburg. I'll let you see a very pretty view of what Johannesburg looks at night. And it was within 3 months, I discovered over 750 new fossil and cave sites in that region. And then the discovery of Sediba would come along at the side of Malapa, and my life would fundamentally change. But I want to step back now, back into the late 90s and early 2000s. In that same period that this clubbiness was at its peak, that we were in the lowest point of discoveries in our field, I also began to get a sense of unfairness in paleoanthropology. It really was controlled by about 6 or 7 people. And here I was, a young scientist, in control of this large, very large, one of the largest collection of fossil hominids in South Africa. And I began to attempt to create a more open environment. Believe it or not, you couldn't see, and still can't in many countries, the original fossils, even if you were a bona fide science, unless you belonged to a certain group or had made certain genuflections towards the discoverers of those particular finds. And that I thought was unfair, and perhaps a little bit it came from, I did not come from a privileged background from one of the classic schools of paleoanthropology. My mentors until I reached South Africa were not the most famous and powerful paleoanthropologists. And so I began to try to open that, and that was really a bridge too far, a decade too soon. Because what that literally did was made me a great many enemies amongst those very powerful people, and they went about trying to destroy my career at that time, and tried to remove me, even as I began writing about the subject of a need to open access to the wider community of paleoanthropologists. The reason I'm telling you that is not for any sympathy. It's really just to place in perspective the difficulty of communicating science in the sort of historical science of paleoanthropology, when access to originals was very difficult, when it was very closed, and when information was very controlled. You literally had to rely on what the very powerful small group of scientists wrote about these. And that again goes to what I was speaking about earlier, the weaknesses of the field of paleoanthropology at times that I think some people had seen through. The idea that we were often over extrapolating from fragments, and part of the reason for that closed nature of the field was probably due to some of that vulnerability. Of course, when we published Sediba in 2010, it became very quickly one of, if not the largest hominid site on the continent of Africa, a new species called Australopithecus sediba, 2 million years old. And it almost coincidentally, in that period, in the period of about 3 to 4 years before that, so starting about 2005, 2006, we started seeing the first of the sort of new age of discovery that would occur. You all would have remembered the Flores hobbit was discovered in that period. What you probably wouldn't remember, that careers were literally destroyed over that fossil when the discoverers dared say it was actually a new species of hominid. Where the majority of the field, which had already decided that we understood how human origins worked, said that it was really likely a pathological human, a dwarf or some other pathological human, because we already knew that human evolution didn't work that way. And there were literally almost an outright war. Those discoverers were unfortunately just a few years too early before our world would explode. Our world would explode because things like Sediba came along, and almost simultaneously with that, I think a new generation of explorers began moving into the field in different areas. They'd been excluded from the traditional fossil fields of Eastern Africa, and they moved in new areas. And of course, we started seeing many, many new discoveries starting to come out, combined with the ability to using technologies like Google Earth and other methods to actually find fossils. And that was combined with the rise of the ability to use ancient DNA to actually analyze studies, and as we entered the sort of chemical age of paleoanthropology. And all of that was happening simultaneously, so that by the time we've reached the state where the story of discovery of Sediba, and then by the time Naledi came along, we have no earthly idea what's going on in human origins. And anyone who says they do is a liar. The fact is that I just came back from a symposium at the Vatican, and that was of discoverers of these most recent discoveries, everything from Neanderthal art to Denisovans to early humans in the high Arctic, to the stuff we're discovering, to materials in the Far East. And the answer is, if you asked anyone, we shouldn't have called it a symposium on understanding human origins and discoveries. We should have said we have no freaking idea what's going on in human origins right now. And that's just the truth of it. What we know is it's messy. What we know is to expect the unexpected. What we know is the next headline is going to alter some aspect at some time period. What we know is our preconceived sacred cows have almost all had been slaughtered, and that the basic stories of human origins are very difficult to tell right now, because it is not easy. And that is not good words for someone like me talking to people like you, is it? Where you want a nice, simple story to tell kids and say, wow, this is great. And the reason I'm telling you that is I think you should look at it as one of the most exciting periods to teach this subject and to teach evolution. What you should do, and what I've turned to doing over the past 10 years, as I've been in the middle of these discoveries and been part of these discoveries, is to try to stop teaching a narrative that you know is going to be false. Almost a biblical Victorian narrative. The idea that A begets B, begets C, begets D, begets E. It didn't happen that way. There was introgression, it was messy, there were braided streams going on of genetics. And so teach the evidence, but also teach the thrill of discovery, the thrill of our moment of understanding. Let kids understand that we're in a great moment of science and discovery. In the field of paleoanthropology, I would equate the period we're in right now to the space race period of the 1960s in space and avionics. And I truly do feel that way as someone in the absolute middle of it. It's exciting, it's dynamic, and those are things that kids relate to. You can teach the biology behind introgression, looking at how we can see Neanderthals and Denisovans can be different species, and yet we can carry their genome in them. How Homo Naledi can exist out of time and place as a primitive hominid at 250,000 years. At the same time, we used to think modern humans were the only game on the entire planet at that time. And how wonderfully messy is this? And then with the excitement of saying to them when they go, but how is it related to them? Because related to us, because that's the question everyone wants to know, and answer like a scientist. Say, I don't know, but we'll find out. And start maybe exploring ways of figuring out how might a scientist go about finding that out. What if we found ancient DNA? What about the new science of proteomics? How do we look at perhaps characters of relationships with other hominid species that we might use as a teaching exercise? I would strongly urge you to move away from trying to go back to this rote idea of phylogeny, because you're going to be wrong. And then in a few years, they're going to look back at you and they're going to distrust everything you said when they realize that what you were teaching them was just a simple, convenient story. Now, how you get out of that when you have a curriculum to teach that they're going to be tested upon, that may be something that you should discuss in this workshop around that. But the way we're doing that in South Africa, both Sediba and Naledi, you might be surprised to hear, have appeared on the national matriculation and anti-matriculation exams several times over the past 8 years, which is something we're very proud of. Could you imagine the United States, something like the story of Sediba or Naledi being in a national exam, like the essay on the SAT or something like that? And it's something that and the reason we got there is because we've told the story of these discoveries. We've said we don't know. We've tried not to get into any of those warfares that colleagues keep driving you into by saying where these necessarily fit, by saying the honest answer of we don't know. But we follow that up with, but no one else does either. And are using this period of discovery to talk in that way, both to children, and children actually respond to that really well. I think they respond to that in a way that, in the honesty of that, and audiences actually respond to that, and so do politicians, because you sometimes are removing the threatening aspect of the ideas that some people, we all know wrongly, have with the idea of evolution and its perceived threat to their belief systems. I'm not going to go deeply into that, except to reinforce that one of the things, if you read John Hawkes in my book, Almost Human, or my children's book, Skull in the Rock, or any of the articles that I write, I tend to, or even Dawn of Humanity, the documentaries, what we tend to do is try to engender a spirit of discovery and exploration, letting people come to their own conclusions and find them in an age where we don't have the answers. I do not believe it is healthy to lie to people today, and you are lying unless you're dealing with just the facts of the relationship studies. You know, the aDNA, the fact Denisovan DNA exists, is a fact, The fact that it is in certain populations of humans and experts is a fact. What that really means right now, we don't know. What are the introgression of Neanderthal DNA means in humans, what the particular percentage that you might get out of a 23andMe or a National Geographic kit, we don't actually truly understand what that means. We will understand, but we don't right now. And the same is true for the fossils that we're discovering. The same is true of the many discoveries that you're going to hear our teams have already made, and you're going to hear later this year, and you're going to hear next year, that are very exciting and are going to be equally disruptive to almost everything we know about the sort of periods around these ancient fossils and their behaviors. I speak a lot to politicians. I work in South Africa would describe itself as a very Christian country, and we have suffered small attacks by the fundamentalist right for the teaching of evolution, but they've been unsuccessful. And as I said, it's so unsuccessful that it's still reached the national curriculums at high school levels within that. And one of the reasons we've been successful in deflecting those attacks, some of which, by the way, have come from some of the most senior politicians, is, for example, I'll give you one. When we announced Homo Naledi, one of the ministers in our country came on a major talk show, the largest radio talk show in South Africa, and said that I didn't come from a monkey. And that was that's a very poignant thing, particularly in the South African mindset because of the history of apartheid, where monkey had been used as a derogatory term for black people under apartheid. And so when that term is being bandied about, it can have devastating and damaging effect within the popular within popular culture and within the populace. And so I immediately came on that same radio show and I said, Mr. Minister, you are absolutely right. You didn't descend from a monkey, but neither did Homo Naledi. And in doing that, used it as a teaching opportunity to talk about the difference between apes, the evolution of bipedal apes, the relationship of Homo Naledi to humans, and how much we don't know it at this time, and how exciting that was to discover, and immediately diffused that situation. And actually that minister is now a big supporter of our work and actually promotes it within our systems here. So it is a very exciting time to be teaching human evolution in particular. It's a very exciting time to be in the process of discoveries and being in the middle of this. There probably never has been a more exciting time. To give you some ideas, I'll give you some factoid statistics that I've just been looking at some of them. But in the last 5 years alone, just our teams here in South Africa have more than doubled the entire fossil record of hominids on the continent of Africa. That's how rapidly the discovery period is changing. We have discovered multiple new hominid sites, multiple new localities, and that's now occurring across the continent. It's obviously also occurring across the world. You just saw the discovery in the Philippines, probably, of Homo luzonensis that was discovered. And what you can expect from that is that's going to happen on a very regular basis. I can assure you of that because I know it to be true because our teams have made those discoveries. We're just in the process of doing refereed scientific publications on them, and so I would plead with you to use this great period of discovery and exploration, to use it in creative ways, to teach science, to communicate science, and engage people who, and students and adults and parents and administrators who may see evolution as a threat, to diffuse some of that threat, because nothing engages people like getting excited about something, rather than getting bogged down in details that we frankly don't have the answer to at this particular time. I think I'm going to stop there. I think we have about 25 more minutes, and maybe take some Q&A if there is any, or have a discussion, or go in any direction you want. Is that okay with the moderators there?
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Any question?
Yep.
With your live Skype session, the changes in your hypotheses, like have the students or the audiences brought new ideas or new theories to your team to explore?
So if I can interpret the question, that has the public outreach that we've done, the communication, lectures, the talks with school kids, have they brought new things to us that have allowed us to alter our ideas or enrich the science that we do? Is that the question?
Yeah.
The answer is absolutely yes. I'll be fair, the majority of the time it's no. That's not why we're doing it. And if I had to hear one more time another theory about how Homo Naledi got into that cavern, I've had everything from giant spiders to running away from there was a sex dungeon that they were. I've had everything, but you know, every now and then there is a gem, and surprisingly, it rarely comes from adults. It comes from kids, where they tend to look at our problems in a way that's often simpler. And one of them, I'll give you an idea of one of those, was that when we were discussing Sediba in the early years, a kid that I was talking to in one of these classes, we were experimenting with these early sort of online classes, talking like in a group like this, and the internet was a lot poorer at that time. But we were talking about a picture that had come out that John Gertz had drawn of Sediba falling into the cave, because at that time the idea was that they were trying to get to water or something, and they'd taken a fall. And the one kid said, well, you know, when my brother took a fall on tennis court, he fractured the top of his elbow. And it was a funny thing to say, because of course I know that, I'm a paleoanthropologist, and of course our taphonomists know that. But for some reason, we'd not really conducted a detailed breakage study looking specifically at an extended forearm fall. And when I just casually emailed our taphonomists, who just happened to be beginning the analysis, I said, you know, take a look at the proximal ulna of Sediba. And sure enough, there is a proximal fall at fracture that is exactly like what you would expect in a stiff arm forward falling situation. So, you know, something like that is a question that forced me to ask that question of a team that just happened to be working on that problem, which led to discovery. And that kind of small thing often happens many times. It jars something that maybe we are missing. John will have heard me use this many times, but I often speak of backyard syndrome. And it is a real danger as an explorer and as a group of scientists when you're working on things that you become very familiar with, or you're working in areas that you are very familiar with, you develop what I call backyard syndrome. And I've used this term in some of my books, but what backyard syndrome is, it's a wonderful, by the way, experiment to do with your classrooms. If you go to your classroom and say, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to draw a place you're familiar with. I want you to draw, everyone has a kitchen, or a kitchen's a good place because it's got lots of stuff in it. So I want you to draw your kitchen. And have the kids draw their kitchen as they perceive it. And then turn around and say, okay, I want you to look around this room. Now I want you to leave the room. I want you to draw the room you're in. Which do you think would be more accurate? It's going to be the room that they've left most recently. It's not going to be their kitchen, even though they will largely think they have a better idea, even though they've just been a few minutes in the room, they will have a better idea of what their kitchen looks like. And the reason that that's there is that that's the way our brain works. Our brain protects us from the noise of environments that we are in constantly by dumbing them down for us. So you're not seeing the hyper detail. It's how you can have a Post-it note on your fridge, you know, that dates back 6 or 7 years. And and the way our brains are wired by evolution, by the way, and it's a great way to teach evolution, is as we enter a new place, we immediately hyperanalyze it because we need to learn it, because we need to know if there's anything dangerous within it, and we need to know escape routes, and we need to know the kind of things that our brain is wired for when they come into a new space. And so we absorb it and store it hyper accurately until we are comfortable that we know it, and then we erase it. And that's where all those fun experiments like, you know, the gorilla that walks across the stage behind people, it can occur after that. But so, and the reason I'm saying that is that very often we're blinded by this familiarity. I certainly faced that for 17 years. I was working in a place for 17 years. I thought there were 14 fossil sites in it. There were hundreds of fossil sites, and everyone else did too. And so we quit looking.
My question is mainly, you said that about 10 years ago is when the field really took off, and you see it being, you know, like the next space race in multiple locations. I'm assuming that what really made it take off was the discovery of satellite information. Or just satellite for locations on where to dig. So 2 questions. First is, what were the 3 things in the last, let's say, 10 years that really kind of jump-started it? And then from here, because all of my kids are 12 years old, what do you think in the next 10 years are going to be, let's say, the 3 big things that are going to further the exploration from here?
Sure. Okay. So let me go back. I don't think it was solely satellite. I think satellite was kind of a symptom of a technological revolution that was occurring at that time, that was being driven by the computer processors becoming large enough to handle big data. That's what really happened. The idea that computer processors could handle not just, you know, you guys are mostly probably too young for this, but you know, when I was starting an expedition in 1998 and had to buy a computer to handle 80 megabyte files of satellite images, the computer cost about $8,000. It was a mega computer at that time to handle 80 megabytes of data. What really happened around 2005, 2006, 2007 was a revolution in computer processors that could handle big information. So CT scans became available. You could handle ground penetrating radar data on your desktop. You could handle Google Earth on your desktop, which didn't really exist prior to those areas. And it was the symptom of the computer processing reaching a critical moment that allowed technology to be readily available everywhere. This was the period of the smartphone emergence and all that, but that's all being driven by those very same processors and batteries and all the things that went around with it. But there's something else in there too. I think there were a key series of discoveries, and without sounding overboasting, I think Sadiba was one of those that said there's actually what those guys were saying in the last few years that science of discovery was over was BS. That there was stuff out there, and sometimes it was right in front of you. You know, Malapa was so easy to find. A 9-year-old did it. It wasn't like it was, you know, it wasn't like it was right in front of us. And I think that you started having that. I think that the generation in my particular field that was blocking access to the fossil fields, it was creating this mythology of scarcity, began to get old and were less able to fight. And a generation that grew up on open access and on the idea that we don't actually have to know exactly how things work to actually manifest them. It was my generation of engineers and scientists that invented companies that have no infrastructure, don't sell anything, and are the richest companies in the world, right? Google and things like that. And we thought about the value of data. I was one of the early footers in Wikipedia and tried to found the breakaway citizendium because we knew Wikipedia was not going to work, right? That's how insightful we were at that time. And so I think there became a generation came along that didn't believe that was true. And that, you know, there is a strong part, scientists are just humans ultimately, and there's a strong part of believing that things can be discovered, and you need a few breakthroughs. In my field, I could probably go on for quite a long time about those discoveries. Flores was one of the early breakthroughs through it, but it didn't catch hold. Sediba quickly followed that, and then we had the great breakthrough in organic paleontology, the many discoveries, Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan, things we spit out of our mouth as if they were old news and we knew it all along, didn't exist at that time. That's all new information that's come along in the last few period. Things like Homo Naledi came along. We have in East Africa earlier and earlier, early Homo, or what we think is early Homo. You have stone tool use. You know, 10 years ago, the oldest stone tools would have been 2.1 million years old. Now they're 3.2 and climbing back in time. We have Neanderthal art now. We truly appreciate the complexity of other species. We're beginning to be aware that of this tremendous diversity that's occurring in the past. So there aren't really three things. It's everything. The idea of the immutability of species. 10 years ago, we were still teaching the idea that biological species were immutable, that they did not, it couldn't be a distinct species and still exchange genes. That's gone. And that's vanished in the last decade, really in the last 7 or 8 years. So that's a kind of revolution that we're in, and I haven't even scratched the surface of, you know, high Arctic humans prior to there being humans in Europe, and how's that possible? And the ideas of, you know, and on and on and on, and the idea that there are early humans in places like Australia. What's in store for those youngsters that over the next decade for them, I have a little bit of idea, but I can't tell you right now because we're going to be announcing some of the things. What I would say to you is that let me give you kind of a hint. I think I think we're at a stage where no one is going to be surprised about strange new species of hominids being found anywhere on the planet right now, whether it's the old world or the new world, and that you're gonna. You saw how Homo luzonensis from Philippines wasn't even a blink. Everyone said, okay, another one, and you're going to start seeing that happen because we're going to start finding more and more of those. I think there's going to be a lot of major discoveries around behavior. We can see into the past in ways that we couldn't before. We are going to find fossil hair. We're going to find ancient DNA. Proteomics is going to have major breakthroughs. We're going to know the sex of these individuals, even at millions of years in time depth. We're going to understand relationships did exist between species through things like proteomics, which last a lot longer than DNA. And so you're going to have real science behind some of these. You're going to see explosion in the number of fossils. We're going to become a data evidence-based science in human origins, and that is rapidly coming true in almost every region because people started looking again and didn't start in the same little places they were looking before. And in the behavioral areas, I think that almost nothing we think of as sacred to our identity as modern humans is true anymore. That we're going to find that these behaviors go into the deep past, that there were multiple experimentations, and just like we, had our bubble blown for stone tools when Jane Goodall saw chimpanzees fishing, and then we find lots of animals use tools, and just how we understand that other animals are deeply complex, birds adorn, and that we're part of, that we're going to find that we modern humans, while we are very dangerous and very widespread and very numerous, are nothing special in the past and really haven't been that special at all. And there is nothing that sticks us out except that we're just probably one of the most dangerous animals that's ever lived right now.
So anytime one of my students talk to scientists in a situation like this, they always have one question, which is, what is one thing that you wish everyone knew about being a scientist or being a paleoanthropologist or whatever angle you want to take? That
it is the most fun you can have, period. I don't care what other example gift. And that you know, you get to live that childlike dream. I often use the term explorer instead of scientist, because I think all scientists are explorers. I actually think we should start using that in place of scientists, because scientist has such a politicized connotation that you know, yet what we really are people that have never dropped the spirit of exploration. The idea that there's something to be discovered out there, and that there must be some way of making that discovery, whether it's inside a lab, a petri dish, whether it's in your backyard, or whether it's a brand new species of hominid, or whether it's just going into space to figure out how to do it. And that's all science. And it's hell of a fun. And it's new because you never ever know what's going to happen, no matter how much you think you predicted that. You're always going to be surprised by it. And what better way to go through life than constantly being amazed and wondered by and in wonder by what is in front of you, or what you've been allowed, engaged, or driven to make happen. That's what I'd say.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I have a question. So we go back to Leakey and the research from, you know, way before you started your research, and I wondered, do you see a not definitive, but a more developed answer as to how human evolution came about in your lifetime?
Okay, so I guess the answer is yes and no. I think that I think because we were a field that had so scarce evidence, we developed, you know, if you really think about it, the kind of story that we were talking about, Animensis to Afarensis to early Homo habilis, Homo erectus humans, that story is a little different than what the Victorians were saying, in a really deep sense. And so that while there was evidence that had changed, you know, we had actual fossils that appeared to support part of that story. That story had not varied a great deal from the way it was being taught 90 or 100 years ago, and that's really odd and really surprising. So I think we know a tremendous amount about human evolution right now. We know a great deal of detail. We know of many more species and its diversity. We're down to their genomes and their proteomics. At the same time, these very discoveries are telling us that there's just stacks we don't know. And we have some ideas of where the direction are. We know there's a species that shared DNA with humans 200,000 years ago in Africa, but we don't know if we found it yet. Is it Homo Naledi? Is it something else? Is it something we haven't seen before? And if those are there, we also suspect, in the kind of way that dark matter exists or whatever, that there are things underneath that we're missing. You know, those are signals that there are areas that we're going to find other examples of things like that. So the answer is that we know vastly more than we did, not just 30 years ago, when you're kind of referring to 40 years ago, but 10 years ago, than we did 10 years ago. We've learned more, though. I will say this, absolutely. We've learned more in the last 8 to 10 years than we learned in the previous 50 in human origins. That's a fact.
So knowing more and more about the history and how we got to where we are, what story do you think that's painting for the future?
Oh gosh. Can I do the politician thing and answer that in the way I want to? What I think we are seeing is what I think our duty is as paleoanthropologists is to stop treating humans, and the hominid record is if we're special. This was not some inevitable journey to get to us, and we somehow have ownership of this planet because it was some inevitable journey where we eventually became the survival of the fittest and the strongest and wiped all these other things out, because it's simply not true. We're here by freak chance. And there were other things that were likely as complex as us and often complex before us that maybe had nothing to do with us. and that we're just part of this natural world. And if there is a lesson that could be driven deeply into the minds of children, and that is that we are fundamentally, absolutely not special. That's what human origins teaches us. We are another animal on this planet. I think a big part of our massive destructive consumerism behavior on this planet is due to the fact that almost every human being on the world thinks it's separate, and we have some dominion or are owed this planet. But that's just simply not true. That's what human evolution is teaching us now, and it's teaching us more and more and more how unspecial we are. And until we learn that, this planet's in great danger, and thus so are we.
So do you think it's the major importance is just kind of trying to inform the worldview of our students? Can you say that?
Oh,
Because,
I absolutely. I think it's. I think
trying to convince them what knowing it, right? So we're trying to convince our students that, because as teachers we want to learn things, right? So, and we like knowledge just because we like to learn things, but we're kind of in the middle. We got to convince them that it's worth knowing. And they're not very philosophical, but you know, but I agree with you that it's because I'm kind of like you. I feel like I have the same worldview in a way that it puts you in your place, you know. But is that enough? Is that the story we tell? You know, those types of things.
we need to ensure that children and adult generations understand that we are foundationally and fundamentally nothing more than just another biological experiment on planet Earth. And we are as vulnerable to these extinction events and these disasters, this present one being caused by us undeniably, as any of these species that aren't here anymore. They were as clever as we were, they were as adapted as we were, and they are gone. And they were being driven to extinction by often much less threatening things than humans and the impact we're having on this planet. So do I think it's important beyond just a simple pursuit of information and knowledge? Absolutely. In fact, I think there's, why is it that 2,500, 3,000 years ago, philosophers knew what was the single most important question that a philosopher asked and needed to understand in order to be enlightened in the world? It was know thyself, right? They knew that at the beginning of philosophy. And that's just what we're doing, except we're doing it on a species level basis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there any last parting? I guess we'll have one last question and then.
It's not really a question. We talk about how humans want to think that we're special, and I think that humans have a natural tendency to be egotistical. And I think it's really admirable that even though you are a scientist who has made very important discoveries, that you still reach out to young communities, teachers like us, and just thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Yes, thank you very much.
If I could just close on that, the reason I do that is because you are the EMTs, the firemen, the first responders of this future. And without that, we're all going to die. And you're the people who are going to bring that to that next generation. And I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.